Some waterways carry ships, others carry the world's economy. That is why the Strait of Hormuz is being compared to the Suez Canal crisis of 1956. Both are narrow routes. Both sit at the center of the global energy flows, and both show how a choke point can suddenly become a political weapon. In this interview with DawnNews English, historian Professor Giuliano Garavini argues that the comparison between the Suez Crisis of 1956 and the current Hormuz crisis is not exact, but it is revealing. Professor Giuliano Garavini begins with the history of the Suez.
So in 1955, Nasser, President Egypt, basically gets weapons from Czechoslovakia. As a reaction to this, the US in 1956 cuts aid to the Aswan Dam, which was a big project, hydroelectric project Nasser was engaged in. And as a consequence of this, Nasser nationalizes the company that used to run the French, British company that used to run the Suez Canal. As a reaction to this so-called nationalization, Israel and then the British Empire and the French Empire intervene in late October 56. And as a further consequences, the Soviet Union manages to, actually to go nuclear against the intervening powers. The US pressures Britain to withdraw, and Nasser blocks the Suez Canal, which was something that was not expected by the invaders, let's call them that way. At the time, the Suez Canal was very important as an energy choke point, because Western Europe depended in general from the Persian Gulf oil for 90% of all the oil that it imported, and from Suez Canal passed half of the oil that went to Europe.
In 1956, after Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, France, and Israel launched a military intervention. At the time, Suez mattered because Western Europe relied heavily on oil coming from the Gulf, and a large part of that oil was moved through the canal. So when Suez was blocked, Europe felt the shock immediately. Garavini says the crisis around Hormuz is even bigger. That is because Hormuz is not just about oil for one region.
So let's see how this situation compares with Hormuz today. Obviously, first thing that comes to my mind is that there was no specific act of the Islamic Republic that would have triggered the attack by the US on Israel at the end of February, apart from a very deep-seated antagonism towards the Islamic Republic since a very long time, at least since 1979. So that's different. During the first day of the attack, they killed the supreme leader of Iran, which actually did not happen in Suez, even though there were talks about actually killing Nasser before the attack. Also, Egypt as a Nasser, as a newly formally independent country, was very recent, while the Islamic Republic is, since 79, very anti-Western protagonist. Plus, also the difference is that Iran did not control Hormuz, the Hormuz Strait. It was a free waterway, and it's only now becoming a contested passage. This is different from Suez, because in Suez, Egypt actually owned the Suez Canal. But what could be the similarities? Israel is once again one of the key actors of the invasion. And it's siding with the imperial power of this age, if you want to define it as such, which is the United States. And its aim is to weaken a regional antagonist, as it was Nasser's Egypt in 1956. The other actor, the United States, whatever the motivations might be, we can go through this later, but probably also saw in the intervention potential to replicate the success it had in Venezuela and basically changing the regime through very smooth and easy action.
Today, around 1/5 of the world's oil moves through the strait. A large share of LNG moves through it too, and so do petrochemical products used to make fertilizers and other industrial goods. In simple terms, Suez was a huge energy crisis for Europe. Hormuz is a much wider crisis for the global economy. Garavini makes that point very clearly.
From an energy point of view, the crisis in Suez was basically an energy crisis for Western Europe, because Western Europe was the key area that imported oil, while globally the world was not still so heavily reliant on oil as a key energy source. So it was a crisis for Western Europe, and Western Europeans were scared, and they also reacted. For example, in 1957, they created Euratom, which was the idea of cooperating on atomic energy to shift from the consumption of oil to nuclear energy. While for the rest of the world, 1956 was not so important. Instead, Hormuz is gigantic because it's a global energy crisis. It's a crisis of production. It affects, yes, European countries and obviously not the United States, but it affects most of the Eastern European economies. And by the way, the largest economic actors in the world are Eastern economies like China, India, and Indonesia alone, I think, are 30% of world GDP. So it's a huge economic area. Plus, it's not only a crisis for oil, but it's a crisis for natural gas, and it's a crisis for petrochemical products. So it's a broader, more complex and global energy crisis. And if it lasts, it obviously depends on how long this will last for.
He says Suez was mainly a crisis for Western Europe because that was part of the world's most dependent on the canal's oil route. But Hormuz affects a much larger economic map. It hits Asia most of all, and that matters because Asia is now the center of global demand. China, India, and other Asian economies depend heavily on the Gulf energy, which means any disruptions here spreads much further and much faster. So this is just not an oil shock. It is also a shock to gas, petrochemicals, industry, and eventually prices people pay in everyday life. At the same time, he also points to an important difference. In Suez, Egypt actually controlled the canal. In Hormuz, Iran did not control the strait in the same way before this crisis. It was a free waterway that has now become contested.
Obviously, Iran has no legal right to control the Strait of Hormuz. And this is a moment where a lot of actors, starting from the United States, have a total disrespect for the UN and legal rights. So one cannot blame Iran for not respecting something that the United States and Israel are basically not respecting openly since a very long time. But obviously this opens a scenario where every choke point in the world, every critical infrastructure, every critical waterway can be subject to be militarily contested if there is no alternative of international cooperation on these strategic choke points. So what I'm wondering is, for example, since most of the countries have been or are still, most of the countries in the Persian Gulf, members of OPEC, they are members of an international organization that deals with the production of petroleum. So if they can still cooperate, even they are at war with one another or in very strong conflict with one another, they still are members of the same organization. Could they not extend that cooperation to cooperate over the transit of oil and oil products in Hormuz? Maybe it's far-fetched, but one wonders if they can cooperate on production, they could maybe cooperate on transit. And the other bigger question I have in mind, I think a lot of people had in mind, is at one point, once the US and Israel were bombing civilian infrastructures, killing schoolgirls, and Iran seemed unable to to react, a lot of people ask, so where is China? And I think, that's an unfair question to a certain extent, because China doesn't have a policy to intervene militarily across the world. But still, it's quite striking that there doesn't seem to be a mechanism for security and mediation created by BRICS. So BRICS is an economic grouping that still doesn't have a security aspect.
So the situations are not identical, but the strategic similarity is still obvious. In both cases, a narrow maritime route became the pressure point with global consequences. The next part of the interview moves from history to power. In 1956, the major actors shaping events were the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Nations.
So the emerging actors after 1956, you mentioned, of course, the Soviet Union, which after 1956 became a reference point of the so-called progressive Arab states in the Middle East. In 1958, after the revolution, it became a reference for Iraq, for Syria, for Nasser's Egypt, for Algeria. The Soviet Union contributed in a way to the willingness of these countries to take sovereign control over their oil sector. So one is the Soviet Union. Then you mentioned, of course, the United States that starts to, change to become the reference point in the Middle East, especially with its special relations with Saudi Arabia and with Iran to contain Arab nationalism and the spread of socialism. But also there are other actors that emerged in 1956. So Nasser himself and Arab nationalism, which was hugely popular at the end of the 1950s, but also, and this is important for what I'll say later, even the UN. People forget that the so-called blue berets of the UN were actually, for the first time, entered into force as a way to solve the Suez Crisis through the UN expeditionary forces. They were sent with, actually it was the Canadians, I think, who introduced this color for the helmets to supervise the withdrawal of forces and to secure the borders between Egypt and Israel.
Today, Garavini says the cast is different. China, India, Russia, Pakistan, and BRICS all matter. Pakistan appears as a mediator. China is central because of its economic weight and energy dependence. Russia remains a strategic player. And Europe, he says, looks almost absent.
Forward to Hormuz, what are the new actors that emerged during this crisis? Of course, there's the new mediators, such as Pakistan, which to a certain extent takes the place that the UN should have had in mediating, discussing. But this is due to the total marginalization of the UN in today's world compared to what it was in 1956, when it was not central, but it was still an important actor in resolving global crisis. Then there is the relevance of BRICS in general today, which were very marginal in 1956. China is a huge economic partner for Iran and an important energy importer for the Gulf countries. India, that has very strong economic, cultural, but obviously also migratory link with the Persian Gulf states. A tradition of non-alignment. Of course, Russia, that to a certain extent is a long-term role that Russia has played in the Gulf in general. That is an actor also on the military side, and different from what happened in 56. European countries, EU seems to be basically non-existent as a regional actor.
That tells us something important. This is no longer a bipolar world like 1956. It is more fragmented, more multipolar, and harder to state. And that leads to the most striking question in the interview. Could this be a Suez moment for the United States? Garavini does not say that the answer is settled yet, but he argues that, like Britain and France in 1956, the United States may be discovering that military strength does not automatically guarantee political control over a strategic waterway.
There's one general question which maybe refers in general to the way you framed this comparison. Are we witnessing the Suez moment of the United States in the Persian Gulf? We obviously don't know yet. We do know that the United States seems to have been unable up to this moment to defend Hormuz, as France and Great Britain didn't manage to defend Suez. They could not totally enforce the security of the regional allies, Gulf monarchies in particular, and also the centrality of the dollar as a means of payment for oil and potentially for the passage through the Strait of Hormuz has been openly questioned. So there's this general framework that we could have in mind. We don't know how it will end. But what are the most interesting, the interesting points from my point of view?
That is what makes the comparison so powerful. His final warning is his biggest one.
And to a certain extent, these kind of crises make you wonder if it is not the time for this group of countries to reason also in terms of creating some form of cooperation over mediation of conflicts, over security. I'm not arguing there should be obviously a military intervention mechanism similar to NATO, and actually NATO is not a good example. It has played on the offensive more than on the defensive in the last years after the end of the Cold War. But that there should be some form of mechanism by which these countries could cooperate over security and peace mediation and mediation of conflicts. That is an emerging question to me, especially in a moment in which in which the United Nations doesn't seem to have that role. So either you rejuvenate the UN in some ways, and I don't see how that's happening, or there has to be some other way for cooperating internationally on security and on mediation.
If international law is weakened, and if major choke points can simply be contested by force, then the risk does not end with Hormuz. It creates a world where any strategic route can become unstable. For more such explainers, subscribe to DawnNews English.